On September 30th, 2015, the sound of Amazing Grace echoed through George's death chamber for the first and last time in over 70 years. The voice was trembling, broken, yet somehow beautiful as it filled the sterile room where justice meets its final moment. Kelly Renée Brookshire, the only woman on George's death row, was singing her farewell to the world. But this was not just any execution. This was the end of a story so complex, so morally challenging, that it would divide an entire nation and force us to confront uncomfortable questions about justice, forgiveness, and what it truly means to be human. Have you ever made a decision in anger that you immediately regretted? Maybe you said something cruel to someone you loved, or acted out of hurt and watched the consequences unfold. Now multiply that feeling by 1,000. What if that single decision in a moment of desperation destroyed everything you ever loved? What if it cost someone their life? Kelly Brookshire knows exactly how that feels, because her moment of rage and calculated betrayal led her to become the mastermind behind her own husband's brutal murder. This is not just another true crime story about a woman who snapped. This is about how a small-town girl from rural Georgia became the first woman executed in her state in over 7 decades, and why her final moments singing that hymn continue to haunt everyone who witnessed them. Here is what makes this case so disturbing. Kelly did not kill her husband herself. She convinced her lover to do it for her, while she established an alibi miles away. She planned it, she waited, she profited from his life insurance, and then she lived with that secret for months before the truth came crashing down. But here is what makes this case so complex. The woman who sang Amazing Grace in that death chamber was not the same person who planned that murder 18 years earlier. Prison had changed her, time had changed her, and by the end, even some of her husband's family members were fighting to save her life. When does justice become vengeance? Can someone be both a cold-blooded killer and a genuinely remorseful human being? And what do we do when the person we want to hate shows us their humanity in the most unexpected moment? If you have ever wondered how far desperation can push someone, hit that like button and let us explore one of the most complex cases in American criminal history, because Kelly Brookshire's story will challenge everything you think you know about crime, punishment, and whether redemption is possible, even in the darkest circumstances. This is the story of a woman who planned the perfect murder, lived with the perfect lie, and died singing the perfect song of grace. Kelly Renée Brookshire entered this world in rural Georgia during the 1960s, born into a landscape where dreams often collided with harsh reality. The small communities scattered across Georgia's countryside were places where everyone knew everyone, where secrets were hard to keep, and where your family's reputation could define your entire future before you even had a chance to write your own story. Her childhood was marked by the kind of financial struggles that leave lasting scars on a young mind. The Brookshire family lived paycheck to paycheck, watching neighbors around them enjoy luxuries that seemed impossibly out of reach. Kelly grew up understanding that money meant security, that having enough meant never having to worry about keeping the lights on or putting food on the table. This early exposure to financial instability would later become a driving force in decisions that would cost lives. But Kelly was different from other children in her community. Teachers and neighbors noticed she possessed an unusual intensity, a hunger for something more than what her small town could offer. She was intelligent, articulate, and had dreams that extended far beyond the county lines. Yet underneath that ambition lived something troubling. Friends would later describe moments when Kelly's mood would shift without warning, when her bright smile would fade into something cold and calculating. During her teenage years, Kelly developed patterns that would define her adult relationships. She craved attention and validation, often going to extreme lengths to get it. When she felt ignored or undervalued, she would react with a fury that surprised those around her. These were not typical teenage tantrums. These were calculated responses designed to regain control and make people pay attention to her needs. The cycle of poverty in her community was relentless. Young people had limited options: work at the local factory, get married early, or leave town entirely. Kelly watched her peers settle into lives that felt predetermined, accepting marriages and jobs that offered security, but little excitement. She swore she would be different. She would find a way to break free from the limitations that trapped everyone around her. At 18, Kelly met Douglas Brookshire at a local gathering. Douglas was everything Kelly thought she wanted in a partner. He was steady, hard-working, and genuinely kind. More importantly, he saw potential in Kelly that others had missed. He was drawn to her ambition and intelligence, believing that together they could build something better than what either had known growing up. Douglas came from a similar background but had learned to find contentment in simple pleasures. He worked construction, earned an honest living, and dreamed of owning a small home where he could raise a family. To Kelly, Douglas represented security and stability. To Douglas, Kelly represented excitement and possibility. It seemed like a perfect match. Their courtship was intense and passionate. Kelly had found someone who genuinely cared about her dreams and was willing to work toward making them reality. Douglas had found someone who challenged him to think bigger and want more from life. They married young, both believing they had found their escape from the limitations of their childhoods. The early years of their marriage reflected the hopes they both carried. They rented a small house, talked about children, and made plans for a future that felt bright with possibility. Douglas worked long hours to provide for them while Kelly managed their home and began exploring opportunities that might bring in additional income. From the outside, they looked like any other young couple working toward the American dream. However, the financial pressures that had shaped Kelly's childhood did not disappear with marriage. If anything, they intensified. Douglas's construction work was seasonal and unpredictable. There were weeks when money was tight, when bills piled up, and when the future they had planned felt impossibly distant. Kelly found herself reliving the financial anxiety of her youth, and those old feelings of desperation began to resurface. As the years passed, Kelly's personality began to shift in ways that concerned those closest to her. The ambitious young woman who had charmed Douglas was still there, but she was increasingly overshadowed by someone more manipulative and self-serving. Kelly began to resent the limitations of their life together. She wanted more than Douglas could provide, and she was growing impatient with the slow progress toward their shared goals. Douglas, meanwhile, remained committed to building their life step by step. He believed in hard work, patience, and gradual progress. This fundamental difference in approach would eventually create a rift between them that neither recognized was growing wider each day. But here is what nobody saw coming. Kelly's dissatisfaction with her marriage was about to take a deadly turn that would transform her from a frustrated wife into a calculating killer, and Douglas from a loving husband into an unsuspecting victim. The first few years of Kelly and Douglas's marriage painted a portrait of two people genuinely trying to build something meaningful together. They celebrated small victories, Douglas getting steady work on a major construction project, Kelly finding part-time employment that helped with the bills, and the gradual accumulation of household items that made their rental house feel like a real home. These were the moments that sustained them through the harder times. But financial pressure has a way of testing even the strongest relationships. Douglas's construction work meant long days in harsh weather, physical exhaustion, and periods of unemployment during the slower winter months. Kelly watched their neighbors seem to prosper while they struggled to keep up with basic expenses. The dreams they had shared as newlyweds began to feel more like fantasies than achievable goals. Kelly's resentment grew slowly at first, then with increasing intensity. She began to view Douglas not as a partner working alongside her, but as an obstacle preventing her from reaching the life she deserved. When Douglas would come home tired from a long day of physical labor, Kelly would see laziness. When he suggested they be patient with their financial goals, Kelly heard him telling her to abandon her ambitions. The man who had once represented security and possibility now felt like a weight holding her down. The arguments became more frequent and more bitter. Kelly accused Douglas of lacking ambition, of being content with mediocrity, while she wanted more from life. Douglas, confused and hurt by this shift in his wife's attitude, tried to work harder and provide more, but nothing seemed to satisfy Kelly's growing dissatisfaction. He began to withdraw emotionally, which only fueled Kelly's anger and sense of abandonment. Into this deteriorating marriage walked Gregory Owen, a man who would become the catalyst for events that would destroy multiple families forever. Gregory was everything Douglas was not: smooth-talking, confident, and seemingly successful. He paid attention to Kelly in ways that made her feel valued and desired. Where Douglas saw problems that required hard work and patience, Gregory saw opportunities and shortcuts. The affair began as an emotional escape for Kelly. Gregory listened to her complaints about Douglas without judgment, validated her feelings of being underappreciated, and painted a picture of a life where she could have everything she wanted. He was attentive, romantic, and most importantly, he seemed to understand her in ways that Douglas no longer did. But Gregory Owen was not the successful man he appeared to be. He had his own financial problems, his own failed relationships, and his own desperate need for a way out of his circumstances. What Kelly saw as strength and success was actually a carefully constructed facade, hiding a man as desperate as she was. As the affair intensified, Kelly began to see her marriage to Douglas not just as unsatisfying, but as the primary obstacle to her happiness. Gregory fed these feelings, suggesting that Douglas was holding her back, that she deserved better, and that together they could have the life she had always wanted. The conversations that had once focused on their attraction to each other began to shift toward more dangerous territory. Kelly started to fantasize about what life would be like without Douglas. At first, these were typical divorce fantasies, splitting assets, finding her own place, starting fresh. But then the practical realities set in. Divorce would mean dividing their limited assets, leaving Kelly with even less financial security than she had in the marriage. It would mean admitting failure and starting over with nothing. That is when Kelly's thinking took a deadly turn. Douglas had a life insurance policy through his construction company. Not a fortune, but enough to provide Kelly with the fresh start she craved. Gregory had his own debts and financial pressures that made the prospect of insurance money attractive to him as well. What had started as an affair began to transform into something far more calculated and dangerous. The moment Kelly decided that murder was the solution to her problems was not a sudden flash of rage or passion. It was a cold, deliberate calculation that revealed the depths of her selfishness and her willingness to destroy an innocent man to get what she wanted. She had convinced herself that Douglas was the villain in her story, that he was the reason for all her unhappiness, and that removing him from the equation would solve all her problems. Gregory was initially hesitant about Kelly's suggestions, but his own desperation and his growing dependence on their relationship made him vulnerable to her manipulation. Kelly knew exactly how to present the idea. Douglas was making them both miserable, preventing them from being together, and standing in the way of their future happiness. She painted their relationship as a love story being blocked by an unreasonable obstacle. The planning began in earnest during the winter of 1996. Kelly and Gregory would meet in secret locations to discuss their scheme, refining the details and addressing potential problems. Kelly insisted that she could not be directly involved in the killing, as that would make her an obvious suspect. Gregory would have to be the one to actually commit the murder while Kelly established an alibi elsewhere. Consider this moment. A wife and her lover, sitting together in hushed conversation, planning the murder of the man who had loved and provided for that wife for years. 3 families were about to be destroyed forever by decisions made in secret meetings between 2 people who had convinced themselves that they were justified in taking an innocent life. The trap was being set, and Douglas Gisandena had no idea that the woman he had married, the woman he still loved despite their problems, was actively planning his death. February 7, 1997 started like any other Friday evening for Douglas Gisandena. He had finished his work week, picked up his paycheck, and was looking forward to a quiet weekend at home with Kelly. Despite the tensions in their marriage, Douglas still believed they could work through their problems. He had no way of knowing that this would be the last normal evening of his life. Kelly had been planning this night for weeks with meticulous attention to detail. She knew Douglas's routines, his habits, and exactly how to manipulate him into the position she needed. The plan she had developed with Gregory Owen was deceptively simple, but required precise timing and flawless execution. The scheme began with Kelly creating a believable reason to leave the house that evening. She told Douglas she was going out with friends, something she had done many times before. Douglas, trusting his wife despite their recent arguments, did not question her plans. He settled in for a quiet evening at home, probably watching television or reading, completely unaware that Kelly was setting the final pieces of his murder into motion. Kelly's first stop was not to meet friends, but to rendezvous with Gregory Owen. They met at a predetermined location, where they reviewed their plan one final time. Kelly would establish her alibi by being seen in public places with witnesses who could verify her whereabouts. Meanwhile, Gregory would go to the Gisandena home and carry out the murder. The timing had to be perfect to ensure Kelly's alibi was ironclad. But the plan hit its first snag when Gregory arrived at the house and found Douglas was not alone. There were complications they had not anticipated, forcing them to improvise. Kelly had to make several phone calls to Douglas throughout the evening, carefully manipulating him into dismissing his guests and preparing for her return home. She played the role of the caring wife, asking about his evening and telling him she would be home soon. Once Kelly confirmed that Douglas was alone and the house was isolated, she gave Gregory the signal to proceed. Gregory Owen, a man who had been seduced by Kelly's promises of love and financial security, was about to cross a line that would destroy his own life as well as end Douglas's. The murder itself was brutally violent and personal. Gregory did not simply shoot Douglas from a distance. Instead, he used a knife, stabbing Douglas multiple times in a frenzied attack that suggested rage and desperation, rather than the cold calculation Kelly had envisioned. Douglas fought for his life, but he was caught completely off guard by someone he had trusted as a friend. The physical evidence from the crime scene would later reveal the terror and pain Douglas experienced in his final moments. He had defensive wounds on his hands and arms, showing he had tried to protect himself from the knife attack. The location and pattern of his injuries told a story of a man who had been betrayed by people he had trusted, murdered in his own home by someone he had considered a friend. While Gregory was committing murder, Kelly was carefully maintaining her alibi several miles away. She made sure to be seen by multiple witnesses, engaging in conversations that would be remembered, creating a timeline that would seem to prove her innocence. She even made phone calls to the house during the time she knew Douglas was being killed, calls that would later be presented as evidence of her concern for her husband's welfare. After Gregory completed the murder, Kelly returned home at the expected time, playing the role of a shocked and grieving wife discovering her husband's body. She called 911, screaming and crying in apparent horror at finding Douglas dead. Her performance was convincing enough that the first responders on the scene treated her as a victim rather than a suspect. The immediate aftermath of Douglas's murder sent shockwaves through the small community where he had lived and worked. Douglas was well liked by his co-workers and neighbors, described as a quiet, hard-working man who had never caused trouble for anyone. His sudden, violent death left people struggling to understand who would want to harm such an apparently innocent person. Douglas's family was devastated by the news. His parents, siblings, and extended family members were forced to confront the reality that someone they loved had been brutally murdered in his own home. They initially supported Kelly in her grief, believing she was a fellow victim of this senseless crime. They had no idea that the woman they were comforting had actually planned and executed their loved one's murder. The investigation began immediately, but Kelly's carefully constructed alibi initially protected her from suspicion. Detectives interviewed her multiple times, and her story remained consistent. She claimed to have been out with friends while an unknown intruder broke into their home and killed Douglas. She provided names and locations that seemed to verify her account. However, the investigation quickly revealed inconsistencies that raised red flags for the detectives handling the case. The crime scene did not match Kelly's description of a random break-in. Nothing of value had been stolen, and there were no signs of forced entry. The murder appeared to be personal and targeted, not the work of a stranger looking for easy money. As detectives dug deeper into Douglas and Kelly's relationship, they discovered the affair with Gregory Owen. Phone records showed extensive communication between Kelly and Gregory in the weeks leading up to the murder. Financial records revealed Kelly's knowledge of Douglas's life insurance policy and her growing desperation about their monetary situation. The evidence was overwhelming, but the story gets even more shocking. Make sure you are subscribed, because what happens next will challenge everything you think you know about justice. The web of lies Kelly and Gregory had constructed was about to collapse, and the truth would reveal the depths of betrayal that led to Douglas Gisendana's death. When Kelly Renée Gisendana's trial began in November of 1998, the courthouse in Gwinnett County became the center of a legal drama that would captivate Georgia and make national headlines. This was not just another murder trial. This was a case that would force the state to confront uncomfortable questions about gender, justice, and the ultimate punishment. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Danny Porter, presented their case with methodical precision. They painted Kelly as a master manipulator who had used her sexuality and emotional control to convince Gregory Owen to commit murder while she maintained plausible deniability. The evidence they presented was damning. Phone records showing dozens of calls between Kelly and Gregory in the weeks before the murder, financial documents revealing Kelly's knowledge of Douglas's life insurance policy, and testimony from witnesses who described Kelly's behavior as calculating rather than genuinely grieving. Prosecutor Porter argued that Kelly was the true architect of Douglas's death. While Gregory Owen had wielded the knife, Kelly had planned every detail, manipulated every circumstance, and profited from the result. She was, in the prosecution's view, more culpable than the man who had actually committed the physical act of murder. This argument was crucial because Georgia law allowed for the death penalty in cases where someone hired or conspired with another person to commit murder. The prosecution's key witness was Gregory Owen himself, who had already been convicted and sentenced to life in prison for his role in Douglas's murder. Owen testified that Kelly had initiated the murder plot, convinced him that Douglas was an obstacle to their happiness, and promised him a share of the insurance money. His testimony was devastating because it came from the person who knew Kelly's true intentions better than anyone else. The defense team faced an almost impossible task. They could not deny Kelly's involvement in the murder plot, as the evidence was too overwhelming. Instead, they focused on arguing that Kelly should not receive the ultimate penalty. They portrayed her as a woman trapped in an unhappy marriage, who had made terrible decisions but did not deserve to die for them. Defense attorneys argued that Kelly was a victim of her circumstances, financial desperation, an unfulfilling marriage, and manipulation by Gregory Owen. They suggested that Owen had been the driving force behind the murder plot and that Kelly had been swept along by his influence. This strategy was risky because it required the jury to believe that Kelly was simultaneously smart enough to plan an elaborate murder scheme, but vulnerable enough to be manipulated by her co-conspirator. The defense also highlighted the rarity of women receiving death sentences in Georgia. Since the state had reinstated capital punishment in 1973, no woman had been sentenced to death and executed. The defense argued that seeking the death penalty for Kelly was influenced by gender bias, and that male defendants in similar circumstances typically received life sentences. This gender argument created significant tension in the courtroom and in public discourse. Legal experts debated whether Kelly was being treated more harshly because she violated societal expectations of women as nurturing and protective, or whether she deserved the same treatment as any other person who planned and carried out a premeditated murder. The trial lasted several weeks, with both sides presenting compelling arguments about Kelly's character, her role in the murder, and what justice looked like in this case. Witnesses testified about Kelly's behavior before and after the murder, with some describing her as manipulative and cold, while others portrayed her as desperate and confused. When the jury returned with their verdict, the courtroom fell silent, guilty on all counts. But the real shock came during the penalty phase, when the same jury recommended death. Kelly Renée Brookshire became the first woman sentenced to death in Georgia in over 70 years. The verdict sent shockwaves through Georgia and beyond. Legal analysts had expected a life sentence, given the rarity of women receiving capital punishment. The decision sparked immediate controversy, with some arguing that justice had been served while others claimed that Kelly was being punished more severely because she had violated traditional gender roles. Media coverage of the verdict was intense and divided. Some outlets focused on the brutality of Douglas's murder and Kelly's cold calculation in planning his death. Others examined the gender implications of the sentence and questioned whether a male defendant would have received the same punishment. The case became a lightning rod for broader debates about capital punishment, domestic violence, and the role of gender in criminal justice. Legal experts noted that Kelly's case would likely face years of appeals, as death penalty cases always do. The rarity of her sentence guaranteed that every aspect of her trial would be scrutinized by appellate courts. Some predicted that her sentence would eventually be overturned or commuted to life in prison. Public reaction was equally divided. Douglas's family expressed satisfaction that Kelly had received the ultimate punishment for her betrayal and the destruction she had brought to their lives. They argued that her gender should not protect her from facing the same consequences as any other person who committed such a heinous crime. But Kelly's story was far from over. Her sentencing was just the beginning of a legal and personal journey that would span nearly 2 decades and ultimately challenge everything Georgia thought it knew about justice, redemption, and the possibility of change. The Georgia Diagnostic and Classification Prison in Jackson became Kelly Gissendaner's world for the next 18 years. Death row is a place designed to strip away everything that makes life meaningful: human contact, privacy, hope, and the simple ability to make choices about your daily existence. Kelly's cell was a concrete box measuring roughly 6 feet by 10 feet, containing a narrow bed, a small desk, and a toilet. This would be her home until the day she died. The daily routine on death row is deliberately monotonous. Kelly woke each morning to the same schedule: breakfast delivered through a slot in her door, limited time outside her cell for exercise in a small concrete yard, and long hours of isolation with nothing but her thoughts for company. She was allowed brief visits from family members and her legal team, but these interactions were conducted through thick glass barriers that made genuine human connection nearly impossible. For the first few years after her conviction, Kelly maintained the same defiant attitude that had characterized her during the trial. She filed appeals and legal motions, insisting on her innocence and blaming others for her circumstances. Her early letters and interviews revealed a woman who still believed she was the victim of an unfair system, someone who had been wrongly convicted and deserved to be freed. But isolation has a way of forcing people to confront truths they have spent years avoiding. As the months turned into years, Kelly began to experience something that surprised everyone who knew her: genuine remorse. The woman who had coldly planned her husband's murder began to understand the full weight of what she had done, not just to Douglas but to his family, her own children, and everyone whose lives had been touched by her actions. Kelly's transformation was gradual but profound. She began participating in religious services offered to death row inmates, initially out of boredom but eventually out of genuine spiritual hunger. She started corresponding with ministers and counselors, exploring questions about forgiveness, redemption, and the possibility of finding meaning even in the most hopeless circumstances. The Kelly Gisendiner who emerged from years of reflection was fundamentally different from the woman who had been sentenced to death. She began writing letters of apology to Douglas's family, acknowledging her responsibility for their pain and asking for forgiveness she knew she might never receive. She reached out to her own children, trying to rebuild relationships that had been destroyed by her actions and the shame of her conviction. Her legal team continued filing appeals throughout this period, challenging various aspects of her trial and sentence. They argued that her original defense had been inadequate, that the death sentence was disproportionate to her crime, and that her transformation in prison demonstrated she was no longer the same person who had committed murder. Some appeals were successful in delaying her execution, while others were quickly denied by higher courts. As Kelly's case progressed through the appeals process, she began attracting support from unexpected sources. Religious leaders who had corresponded with her testified to her genuine transformation and spiritual growth. Some of Douglas's own family members, while still grieving their loss, began to question whether executing Kelly would serve any meaningful purpose beyond revenge. The international attention Kelly's case received was unprecedented for a Georgia death penalty case. Her story resonated with people around the world who saw her as an example of both the potential for human redemption and the fundamental problems with capital punishment. Human rights organizations began monitoring her case, arguing that her execution would be a violation of international standards regarding the treatment of female offenders. The most significant international intervention came from Pope Francis himself, who wrote a letter to the Georgia Board of Pardons and Paroles, asking them to commute Kelly's death sentence to life in prison. The Pope's letter emphasized themes of mercy, forgiveness, and the possibility of redemption that had become central to Kelly's own transformation during her years on death row. The Pope's intervention created a media sensation and brought global attention to Kelly's case. Religious leaders across denominations joined the call for clemency, arguing that Kelly's spiritual transformation demonstrated the possibility of genuine repentance and change. They contended that executing someone who had shown such clear evidence of redemption would be a waste of human potential and contrary to Christian principles of forgiveness. By 2015, Kelly Gisendiner had become a symbol of both the complexity of capital punishment and the possibility of human transformation. The question facing Georgia was no longer whether she was guilty of murder, but whether the person she had become deserved to die for the person she had been 18 years earlier. September 30th, 2015 began like any other day at the Georgia Diagnostic and Classification Prison, but everyone knew this would be different. After 18 years of legal battles, appeals, and international intervention, Kelly Renée Gisendiner's execution date had finally arrived. The woman who had become the face of Georgia's death penalty debate would face her final moments before midnight. Kelly had spent her last weeks saying goodbye to the people who mattered most to her. Her children, now adults who had grown up with the burden of their mother's crime, made their final visits. These conversations were heartbreaking for everyone involved. Kelly apologized repeatedly for the pain she had caused them, for the childhood she had stolen from them, and for the shame they had carried because of her actions. Her final day began with the same routine that had defined her existence for nearly 2 decades. Breakfast arrived through the slot in her cell door, but Kelly barely touched the food. She spent most of the morning in prayer and reflection, writing final letters to people who had supported her during her transformation. The woman who had once coldly planned a murder was now preparing to face death with dignity and acceptance. The rituals surrounding an execution are precisely choreographed, designed to maintain order and solemnity during what is ultimately a state-sanctioned killing. Kelly was allowed to choose her final meal, a tradition that offers condemned prisoners one last taste of normalcy before their death. Her choice was surprisingly modest: chips and cheese dip, Texas fajita nachos, and a diet frosted lemonade. This simple meal reflected the woman Kelly had become during her years in prison, someone who found satisfaction in small pleasures rather than grand gestures. As the afternoon progressed, Kelly met with her spiritual advisor for final prayers and counseling. She had requested that her execution be witnessed by several religious leaders who had supported her clemency efforts, people who had seen her transformation firsthand and believed in her genuine repentance. Their presence would provide comfort during her final moments, and serve as testimony to the change that had occurred within her. The execution chamber at the Georgia Diagnostic and Classification Prison is a sterile, clinical room designed to make death appear medical rather than violent. Kelly was brought into the chamber at 11:39 in the evening, strapped to a gurney where she would receive the lethal injection. The witnesses, separated by glass windows, included members of Douglas's family, Kelly's supporters, and representatives from the media. What happened next would be remembered by everyone present as one of the most extraordinary moments in the history of American capital punishment. As the medical team prepared the intravenous lines that would deliver the fatal drugs, Kelly began to sing. Her voice, trembling but clear, filled the death chamber with the familiar words of Amazing Grace. The choice of this particular hymn was deeply significant. Amazing Grace speaks of redemption, forgiveness, and the possibility of salvation, even for those who have committed terrible acts. The lyrics, Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound, that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now am found, was blind, but now I see, seemed to capture Kelly's own journey from calculated killer to repentant human being. Her voice carried through the chamber as she sang verse after verse, her words becoming more emotional with each line. Witnesses later described the profound impact of hearing this hymn sung by someone facing imminent death, someone who had found faith and redemption in the most unlikely circumstances. Even those who supported her execution were moved by the genuine emotion in her voice. Between verses of the hymn, Kelly spoke her final words to the people she was leaving behind. She addressed Douglas's family directly, acknowledging the pain she had caused them, and asking for forgiveness she knew she might never receive. Her voice broke as she said, "I am so sorry for what I did to all of you. I hope you can find peace." But her most heartbreaking words were reserved for her own children, who had lived with the consequences of her actions for 18 years. Looking toward the witness area where they sat, Kelly repeated the same phrase over and over. "I love you, I love you, I love you, and I am so proud of you." These were the words of a mother who knew she had failed her children in the most fundamental way, but wanted them to know that love had somehow survived even her worst actions. The lethal injection began flowing through the intravenous lines at 12:10 in the morning on October 1st. Kelly continued singing Amazing Grace, even as the drugs took effect, her voice growing weaker but never stopping entirely. The medical team monitored her vital signs as the sodium pentobarbital induced unconsciousness, followed by drugs that would stop her breathing and heart. At 12:21 in the morning, Kelly Renée Gisandana was pronounced dead. The first woman executed in Georgia in over 70 years had died as she had lived her final years, with faith, remorse, and a recognition of both her crimes and her humanity. What happened next divided the entire nation. Drop a comment and tell me what you think about what I am about to reveal, because Kelly's death sparked a debate that continues to this day about justice, redemption, and whether we can ever truly separate the person someone becomes from the crimes they committed in their past. Kelly Gisandana's execution sent shockwaves far beyond the walls of the Georgia prison where she died. Her case became a catalyst for national conversations about capital punishment, gender equality in criminal justice, and the fundamental question of whether people can truly change after committing horrific acts. The debate about capital punishment intensified immediately following her death. Supporters of the death penalty argued that Kelly had received exactly what she deserved. She had planned and executed the murder of an innocent man for financial gain, showing calculated cruelty that warranted the ultimate punishment. They contended that her gender should not protect her from facing the same consequences as male defendants who committed similar crimes. However, opponents of capital punishment used Kelly's case to highlight what they saw as fundamental flaws in the system. They pointed to her genuine transformation during 18 years on death row, arguing that executing someone who had clearly changed and found redemption was both morally wrong and a waste of human potential. The fact that she had become a symbol of spiritual growth and repentance made her execution particularly controversial. The gender aspect of Kelly's case raised uncomfortable questions about how the justice system treats female offenders. Statistical analysis shows that women who kill their husbands typically receive harsher sentences than men who kill their wives, particularly when the woman is seen as violating traditional gender roles. Kelly's case fit this pattern perfectly. She was not the stereotypical battered woman who killed in self-defense, but rather a calculating conspirator who used manipulation and sexuality to achieve her goals. Legal experts noted that Kelly's execution highlighted a double standard in how society views female criminals. Women are expected to be nurturing, protective, and morally superior to men. When they commit violent crimes, especially against family members, the public reaction often includes additional moral outrage because they have violated these gender expectations. Kelly's case demonstrated how this bias can influence both jury decisions and public opinion. But beyond the legal and political debates, Kelly's story offers profound lessons about how seemingly small choices can escalate into life-destroying consequences. Her path to murder began with dissatisfaction in her marriage, progressed through an extramarital affair, and culminated in a decision to solve her problems through violence. Each step seemed logical to her at the time, but together they led to catastrophic results. The progression from unhappy wife to calculating killer reveals how people can rationalize increasingly destructive behavior when they focus solely on their own desires and grievances. Kelly convinced herself that Douglas was the obstacle to her happiness, that removing him would solve her problems, and that she deserved better than what her marriage offered. This self-centered thinking allowed her to justify the unjustifiable. Kelly's story also demonstrates the complex duality of human nature. The same person who coldly planned her husband's murder later became genuinely remorseful and spiritually transformed. This raises difficult questions about identity and responsibility. Was the Kelly who sang Amazing Grace in the death chamber the same person who orchestrated Douglas's killing? Can someone be both victim and perpetrator, monster and human being? Her case challenges our desire for simple categories and clear moral boundaries. We want criminals to be irredeemably evil and victims to be purely innocent. But Kelly's story shows that real people are far more complicated. She was simultaneously a calculating killer and a woman trapped by her circumstances, a manipulative conspirator, and someone capable of genuine spiritual growth. The ultimate lesson from Kelly Gisindana's life and death may be about the importance of recognizing our own capacity for both good and evil. Her story serves as a warning about how unchecked selfishness, resentment, and desperation can lead ordinary people to commit extraordinary acts of violence. It also demonstrates that redemption is possible even in the most hopeless circumstances, though it may come too late to change the consequences of our actions. This case changed how America views female criminals forever. If this story impacted you, share it with someone who needs to hear this message, and make sure to hit that notification bell for more cases that will make you question everything you thought you knew about justice and human nature. The sound of Amazing Grace echoing through Georgia's death chamber on September 30th, 2015, continues to resonate years after Kelly Gisindana's execution. That moment, when a condemned woman found her voice to sing about redemption in the face of death, encapsulates everything complex and contradictory about her case. Kelly's final moments revealed something profound about the nature of human redemption. Here was a woman who had spent 18 years confronting the worst parts of herself, genuinely transformed by the weight of her actions and the possibility of forgiveness. Her tears were real, her remorse authentic, and her spiritual growth undeniable. Yet none of this could undo the brutal reality of what she had done to Douglas, the man who had loved and trusted her. The questions Kelly's case raises about justice and mercy remain unanswered today. Should the justice system focus primarily on punishment for past actions, or should it consider the possibility of genuine change and redemption? Can someone who commits a calculated, premeditated murder ever truly atone for that act? And if they can change, does that transformation matter enough to spare their life? Her story forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the complexity of human nature. Kelly was not the cartoon villain that we prefer our criminals to be. She was a real person with understandable motivations, genuine emotions, and the capacity for both terrible cruelty and authentic remorse. She was simultaneously the cold-blooded architect of her husband's murder and a woman capable of finding God in the darkest place imaginable. This duality challenges our need for moral clarity. We want to believe that people are either good or evil, victims or perpetrators, deserving of mercy or justice. Kelly's case demonstrates that real human beings do not fit into such neat categories. She was both monster and human, calculating killer and repentant sinner, destroyer of lives and seeker of redemption. The echo of her voice singing Amazing Grace serves as a reminder that redemption is possible, even in the most hopeless circumstances. But it also raises the painful question of whether redemption can ever be enough. Kelly found peace with God and forgiveness for herself, but Douglas remained dead, his family remained broken, and her own children remained scarred by her actions. Perhaps the most important lesson from Kelly Gisindana's story is that every choice we make has consequences that extend far beyond what we can imagine. Her decision to solve her problems through murder destroyed not just Douglas's life, but her own, her children's, and countless others who were touched by her actions. The hymn that filled the death chamber that night was about grace, forgiveness, and finding light in darkness. Whether Kelly truly found that grace, or whether she deserved it, remains a question each of us must answer for ourselves. But her story is not unique in its moral complexity. Next time, we will explore another case that challenges everything you think you know about guilt, innocence, and the price of justice.